Yo audience, today we're going to dive into my take on the second holder of One for All in both quirk and identity. This theory is slightly controversial, but let's be honest, those are the best ones. If you enjoy the content we bring you on Texas Smash, please help support the channel by subscribing. You may not think much of it, but even gaining a single subscriber helps the channel immensely. My goal is to get Texas Smash to 100 subscribers by the end of June. Help us get there. Also, make sure to join our Discord server, link in the description, to join an awesome community and participate in our live weekly chapter discussions. Let's nerd out together. Human beings are naturally an arrogant species. We always think we know more than we actually do. We always think, I can do insert anything here better. Unfortunately, the same is true when it comes to anime. Now let me be clear, I am not a dub hater. I personally prefer sub most of the time, but this is not a video about sub versus dub. Stay with me audience, there's a reason I'm bringing up manga translations. While every translator is different, the psychological aspect of, I can make this even better, is still there no matter who is translating. Think about it, how many examples of ridiculous censorship do you know of? Probably a lot if you're a cultured weeb, like I like to think my audience is. Most of the time, this is to make the content more safe for kids because only kids watch anime. Often, it is because the translator feels as if the dialogue he or she is looking at only makes sense in Japanese culture, and therefore needs to be changed so that it makes sense to us. Japanese translation is not a word-for-word process. Many people do not realize the ambiguity of the role of translator. Davisson wrote an extensive article about the problems of translation from the Japanese language to English. Quote, when they choose the translator, editors are choosing what kind of comic will eventually be made. Many readers don't realize the amount of influence translators have over the finished comic. Most translators I know deliver a finished script that goes straight onto the page. My job as a translator is to take all of that context and language and reshape it into something that reads as if it was originally written in English. The Japanese script is my raw material. Along with translating the words on the page, I add context and create bridge sentences that may not have been in the original. I fill in gaps that would have been apparent to Japanese readers, and sometimes I rewrite things entirely. End quote. What is the point of talking about translators and why does it matter to your theory, Kronos, you clickbaiting nerd? I say all of this to drive home the foundation of this theory. Yoichi, the first holder of One for All, is All for One's original manifestation of evil. Chapter 310 is when we cut back to the Vestige world, just as holders 2 and 3 are being convinced to show face for the first time. Part of Yoichi's speech to the second holder is drastically different from the scans to the official translations. The context around this quote is that Yoichi is trying to compare the fact that the ridiculous delusions that Deku has in believing that he can save Tamura is much like the delusions of the second holder when he saved Yoichi from All for One's captivity. The original translation, and keep in mind this is Yoichi talking here, reads as follows. A ridiculous delusion, such a sad way to see it. Then tell me this, why on that day, knowing full well of my ties to your mortal enemy, did you reach out to me? The scan reads as follows. I agree, it's certainly delusional. Just like how a certain pair saved their nemesis and extended a helping hand back then. Some of you may be getting ahead of me here. Someone translated the original Japanese dialogue, someone who does a lot of translating, and they perceived the panel to be stated this way. Of course, this is not the official, but my point here is that there was a translator who reviewed the source material and perceived the dialogue to be Yoichi telling the second holder that he too saved his nemesis, just like Deku is trying to do now. Doesn't this make a lot more sense for Yoichi to be using this as a convincing argument to sway the second holder into helping Deku? The two scenarios are much more comparable if Yoichi was in fact the second holder's enemy. I'm gonna give you guys one more quote from Davisson's article, but I feel like it really drives the point home. Quote, think of it like a band doing a cover song. No matter how good a mimic, every singer adds their own voice and style to the performance. The finished song is neither wholly the mark of one nor the other. That may be a clumsy metaphor, but the point is this. A different translator produces a different comic. Part of that is the nature of the language. Japanese is not translation friendly. It's a high context language as opposed to a low context language like English. This means that Japanese use fewer words and rely more heavily on cultural context to communicate what is going on in a scene. It is sometimes said of Japanese literature that for every word on the page, there are 3 unwritten. Readers are expected to fill in the blanks. End quote. This was a hell of a long way to go about making my first point to this theory, but I'm going to build off this idea of Yoichi being the OG Tamura, and it's critical to the theory. What do we know today? Yoichi had the quirk stockpile forced on him. He was held in captivity and was later rescued by the second and third users. We know Yoichi used this rescue attempt as a correlation of the situation we see today with Deku trying to save Tamura when talking to the second holder. We know that the second can be stubborn and has an attitude much like someone else in the story. Time to let the cat out of the bag here. The answer is right in front of our faces. The second holder is Katsuki. Back you go. I know time travel talk is not everyone's favorite conversation, especially if it's about a series they love. There is just so many possibilities for the story to be mishandled, and it could effectively ruin the series for some. I know Eri could potentially ruin the series for me if Horikoshi is not careful with how he writes her character. I'm hoping she doesn't turn into a cheat code like a certain Dragon Ball Super character. But back on track, let's explain this theory. This will not be nearly as hard to follow as it's going to sound at the beginning. There is only a single time leap here, no paradox, and there's only 2 timelines that we need to be concerned with, and that's it. We will refer to these timelines as Timeline 1, the mostly unknown timeline, but prior to Timeline 2, with the latter being the story we all know and love. We have to start, obviously, with Timeline 1. In this timeline, Bakugo does not come and save Yoichi from captivity. Over time, All For One would force Yoichi to obey his will, whether it be from conventional or non-conventional means. That is the fine print for any gift from All For One. It is to obey his will. That is a large part of the reason All For One puts on this facade of trying to help people, when in reality All For One is just gathering an army of people who are indebted to him. All For One wants an army, and he wants his army to comply with his wishes and help sustain his control of society. Yoichi is All For One's main tool to exert that control over society in Timeline 1. Today, in Timeline 2, we see All For One trying to turn Tamura into the manifestation of evil. In the Vestige world, when All For One and Tamura enter, Yoichi says to All For One in regard to Tamura, "So is he the next in line, brother?" All For One responds with, "It's such a shame I could never make you mine." Keep in mind, this conversation is taking place in Timeline 2. It's almost as if All For One had to settle for Tamura because Yoichi was taken from him. In Timeline 1, Yoichi is the manifestation of evil. We know All For One likes to let his subordinates do most of the dirty work. Yoichi was the symbol of terror in Timeline 1. It makes perfect sense that Bakugo, along with most others, perceived stopping Yoichi as top priority, since this is where the majority of the destruction was coming from. In this timeline, there is no one for all. You can imagine how dark this timeline must have gotten real quick. This is supported by the third user's quote, "We come from the harshest era in history." So, in this timeline, with no real weapon to combat All For One's control, Bakugo travels back in time, originally to kill Yoichi and take away All For One's biggest weapon. However, Bakugo sees Yoichi for the first time in his frail and untampered with body. Bakugo instead goes against his motto and pulls a Deku. He saves to win by kicking down a door. This is Bakugo, remember. In current day, Yoichi says to the second holder, "The moment you reached your hand out to me was when One For All was truly born." Now, if this is truly the history that the first 3 holders share, then doesn't that make so much more sense why Yoichi would use this moment as a comparable to how Deku is trying to save Tamura now? Bakugo 1 was born in a damned world, and in an effort to fix things, he went back in time to remove the problem. With the last second change of plans, Bakugo saves Yoichi instead, thereby creating One For All in the story we know today. There are 2 Katsuki Bakugos in our story, one of which is a soul at this point in time and resides in the Vestige world, The Katsuki we are more familiar with was born later. This makes sense because obviously the worldly circumstances would have been drastically different. This also makes sense why the second holder questions Deku's worth to Yoichi. He never knew Deku. Bakugo 2 is the one who knows Deku. Bakugo 2 does not have to go back in time because he, unlike Bakugo 1, will have a fighting chance to put an end to All for One's reign of terror. So there's no time paradox here. This is nothing more than Subaru Natsuki going back in time to fix something in ReZero, or future Trunks warning Goku of an impending heart attack in Dragon Ball Z. Quick side note here, it does not necessarily have to be Eri that allows Bakugo to time travel. This is My Hero Academia we're talking about. There is a world full of people with different quirks in this story. If Bakugo 1 wanted to find a way to go back in time, he could have found a way to make it happen. As far as the second holder's quirk is concerned, we need to do the opposite of what we usually do with the quirk singularity theory. We need to first curtail the explosion quirk that we know today, as the quirk the second holder wielded would not have awoken to that point, being created much sooner. However, from this curtailment, we then need to stockpile onto that power just as we do with any other quirk from One For All. So this could be even more of a rivalry between Deku and Bakugo. Deku would have an inferior quirk as it was acquired further in the past, but this inferior version would be strengthened from the stockpile ability in One For All. While Bakugo would have all the benefits of the quirk singularity theory in his explosions, but without any power added from stockpile. We could have a blast versus boom situation. One final door to shut. How would Yoichi even know about his transferability in this theory? Well, it could have happened on accident. That's right, that's the kind of quality analysis you can expect to find on Texas Smash. But for real, I don't think it's that far-fetched to say it did happen on accident. How did Stain figure out how his quirk worked? Another guess would be that when All Might was explaining the history of One For All to Deku, he said that the merging of the two quirks resulted in the creation of One For All. It's very possible that this stockpile acquired by Yoichi strengthened transfer enough for Yoichi to feel its presence. What do you think, audience? Is the second holder Katsuki Bakugo? Sometimes we overanalyze and try to read too much into things. We try to solve a puzzle when there isn't much of a puzzle to be solved. Bird's eye view, people. Does it sound like a Kacchan? Does it look like a Kacchan? Then it's probably a Kacchan. If this theory pans out, how do you think Bakugo 2, the one we're more familiar with, will react? Do you think he'll be pissed to discover that he is literally an extra? Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'll see you guys this Friday for our regularly scheduled programming. Come chill with us on Discord and become an official audience member today. We'll see you there.